The sun over Redemption, Colorado, was a benevolent god, casting a brilliant, warm light that made the dust of the main street glitter like gold. It was a town built on second chances, a place where folks came to wash away the grit of harder lives. For U.S. Marshal Jonah Ward, it was simply home. He walked with the easy stride of a man who knew his place in the world, his star pinned to his vest, not as a boast, but as a simple fact, like the color of his eyes. Today, however, the star was on the dresser in his small, neat house, and he was just a husband and a father on an errand. He pushed open the door to Silas Croft's workshop, the little bell above it, chiming a cheerful welcome. The air inside was a fragrant cloud of pine shavings and linseed oil. Silas, a man whose age was etched into the deep lines around his eyes, and the permanent stoop of his shoulders, looked up from his workbench. "Marshal, didn't expect to see you today," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. Jonah smiled, the expression softening the hard lines of his face. "It's Lily's birthday, Silas. She'll be 5. Promised her something special." Silas's own face cracked into a grin. He wiped his hands on a rag and gestured toward a shelf where a small flock of wooden animals stood in silent, perfect formation. There were horses with manes that seemed to ripple deer, poised to leap, and in the center a small bluebird, its wings half spread as if caught in the first moment of flight. Its paint was the color of a summer sky, its tiny eyes 2 pinpricks of glossy black. "That one," Jonah said, his voice quiet. He had watched Silas carve it over the last few weeks, the delicate shape emerging from a block of wood under the patient guidance of the old man's knife. It was for Lily, who loved to watch the birds darting in the yard, her small face filled with a wonder that Jonah felt he could protect forever. As Silas carefully wrapped the bird in a soft cloth, the lazy peace of the afternoon was shattered. It began not with a bang, but with a sudden chilling silence. The normal cacophony of the street, the rumble of wagon wheels, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the hum of conversation died all at once. Jonah's head snapped up. His hand by instinct went to his hip where his Colt would normally rest. He felt its absence like a phantom limb. Then came the shouting, sharp and panicked, followed by the unmistakable crack of a gunshot. Silas froze, his knuckles white around the wrapped bird. What in God's name? Jonah was already moving. "Stay inside, Silas. Lock the door." He stepped out into the blinding sun, and the world had turned upside down. Down the street in front of the Redemption Bank and Trust, men in long dusters and pulled-down hats were backing out, canvas bags slung over their shoulders. One of them, a tall man with a charismatic swagger, even in the midst of chaos, raised a silver-plated revolver and fired it into the air. "A contribution to our early retirement, folks." He boomed his voice, carrying an unnerving blend of charm and menace. "Don't be heroes." Jonah recognized him instantly. Ambrose Garrison, a man with a reputation as cold and sharp as a winter wind. Jonah had been tracking him for months, ever since Garrison's younger brother Caleb had been killed in a shootout with a posse Jonah had led. He'd known this day of reckoning was coming. His eyes scanned the street, searching. And then he saw them. His wife Sarah was standing across the way, frozen in place, a basket of groceries dropped at her feet. Beside her, clutching her skirt, was Lily. They had been on their way to meet him. Sarah's eyes found his wide with terror. Jonah started toward them, his movements desperate, his mind screaming. He had no gun, no cover. Garrison's men were mounting their horses, and their movements practiced and swift. They were professionals. "Get inside," Jonah yelled, his voice raw. Sarah seemed to break from her trance, pulling Lily toward the doorway of the general store. But it was too late. One of Garrison's men, spooked by a dog barking wildly, turned and fired blindly into the street. The bullet whined past Jonah's ear. Ambrose Garrison laughed a sound devoid of all warmth. He raised his own pistol not in panic, but with a deliberate theatrical flourish. "A lesson for the lawman," he shouted, aiming not at Jonah, but into the air above him, a final act of dominance. The shot thundered, echoing off the storefronts. A puff of dust kicked up from the wooden awning above the general store. A woman screamed, and then a different sound, a small, soft gasp. Jonah's world slowed to the pace of a falling feather. He saw Sarah's body jolt, a small dark stain blossoming on the front of her simple cotton dress. He saw her stumble, her hand flying to her chest. And he saw Lily, still clutching her mother's skirt, look down at her own small dress, a matching stain of impossible red spreading across the fabric. They fell together, a single, graceful collapse into the dust of the street. The world went silent for Jonah. The hoofbeats of Garrison's departing gang and the rising wails of the townspeople, the frantic ringing of the church bell. It was all a distant hum. He walked forward, his legs moving as if through deep water. He knelt in the dust beside them, the sun hot on the back of his neck. Sarah's eyes were open, but they saw nothing. Lily's were closed, her face as peaceful as if she were asleep. The chaos had happened so fast, she might never have even felt the pain. His hand, which had been clenched into a fist, slowly opened. In his palm was the small cloth-wrapped package from Silas's shop. His fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the string. He unwrapped the wooden bird. Its bright blue paint seemed to mock the grayness that had just descended over his world. He had bought it for her birthday, the last gift he would ever buy. He looked up, his eyes empty, scanning the horizon where Garrison and his men had disappeared into a cloud of dust. There was no rage in him, yet no thirst for vengeance. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness where his heart had been. He held the small, perfect bird in his hand, its smooth carved wood a cruel reminder of a life that had just been splintered beyond repair. The sun beat down, but Jonah Ward felt nothing but cold. 5 years had passed. 5 years of winters that bit to the bone and summers that baked the granite rock of the high ridge until it shimmered. For Jonah Ward, the seasons were no longer a cycle of life, but a ritual of endurance, a long drawn-out penance. The man who was once a marshal, a husband, a father, was gone, buried in the same grave as his family in the churchyard of a town he could never bring himself to visit again. In his place was a creature of the mountain, hollowed out by grief, his silence as vast and unyielding as the wilderness around him. His cabin was less a home than a tomb he had built for himself. Hewn from the dark timber of the surrounding pines, it stood defiant against the elements, a single room where life had been stripped down to its barest essentials. A stone hearth, a cot, a table, a single chair. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke and solitude. Sun-bleached dust motes danced in the single beam of light that pierced the gloom through a grimy window pane, illuminating the stillness. Outside, the groan of ancient pines in the wind sounded like weeping, a constant mourning song that echoed the hollowness in his chest. His days were a litany of hard, repetitive tasks. He split the wood. The axe fell. Again. The clean crack of timber was one of the few sounds that could break through the fog of his memory. He checked his traps, his movements economical and silent, his face a mask of hardened indifference, whether he found a rabbit for his pot or an empty snare. He ate when hunger gnawed, slept when exhaustion claimed him, and spoke to no one but the horse he kept in a lean-to, and even then only in gruff, single-word commands. His life was a slow, deliberate act of erasure. He was punishing himself, starving the part of him that had once known love, joy, and hope, until nothing was left but the shell of a man. The small carved bluebird sat on the rough mantelpiece above the hearth. Its paint was faded now, its edges worn smooth from the countless times his thumb had traced its shape in the dead of night. It was the only artifact from his past life he had allowed himself to keep a constant, painful reminder of his failure. It was the last gift. The promise he could not keep. The reason he deserved this isolation. One evening, as a blizzard descended upon the ridge, the world outside dissolved into a roaring whiteness. The wind shrieked like a banshee, throwing handfuls of ice and snow against the cabin's shuttered windows. Jonah sat by the fire, oiling his rifle, the rhythmic slide of the cloth over the cool steel a familiar meditation. He had long since stopped feeling the cold. The chill inside him was far deeper than any mountain storm could muster. That's when he heard it. A sound that did not belong. The pounding on his cabin door wasn't strong. It was the sound of knuckles too raw, too weary to make more than a hollow thud against the weathered wood. But in the blackness of the mountain night, even that small sound carried the weight of a world he had abandoned. Jonah froze his hand still on the rifle. He thought he had left humanity behind. Thought no one would dare come this far up the ridge, especially not in a storm like this. The knock came again, weaker this time, followed by a broken voice. A woman's voice, hoarse and torn apart by the wind, yet carrying its plea through the timber walls. "Please, I'll sleep outside your door like a dog if you don't let me in." Jonah's jaw clenched. A familiar rage, cold and sharp, rose in his throat. He had shut his door to the world, to its pleas, its sorrows, its desperate hands reaching out for help. He had learned the cost of opening that door. He rose the floorboards, creaking beneath his heavy boots, and for a long moment he was resolved to ignore it. Let the storm take her. The mountain was indifferent to suffering. So was he. But then the voice came again, softer, shaking now, and with it something else. Another sound, faint and fragile, almost lost in the howl of the wind, a child's whimper. The sound pierced through 5 years of carefully constructed numbness. It was a sound he had forced himself to forget, a ghost in the storm. His grip tightened on the rifle, his knuckles white. Slowly, reluctantly, as if pulled by a force outside his control, he moved to the door and lifted the heavy iron latch. The wind shoved the door open before he could finish the motion, a furious, icy blast that extinguished the lantern and sent embers scattering from the hearth. In its wake, a figure stumbled forward, collapsing against the threshold. Her hair was plastered to her face with sleet, her dress torn at the hem, her shawl nothing more than rags that clung to her trembling frame. And in her arms, wrapped in a thin scrap of quilt, was a child who couldn't have seen more than a year in this world. Her knees buckled, and Jonah caught her before she struck the ground. She was light, too light, the weight of hunger and fear hollowing her frame. The child stirred weakly, a thin cry breaking against the storm before it faded into silence again. "God help us," the woman whispered, her lips cracked and blue, her eyes brimming with a desperation so profound that no tears would fall. She didn't look at Jonah. She only clutched the baby tighter, as if afraid even the mountain air might steal the child away. He carried her inside before she could protest, kicking the door shut with his boot and silencing the shriek of the wind. He laid her on the bearskin rug near the hearth, careful not to jostle the infant. She didn't release the child, even as her body sagged with exhaustion, her arms a cage of fierce maternal protection. "Name," Jonah said flatly, his voice a disused rasp. He knelt beside her, his shadow looming in the firelight. She blinked, dazed, before answering. "Martha. Martha Hale." Her voice cracked on the name, but she forced it through. She angled her chin toward the baby. "His name's Samuel." Jonah nodded once, sharp and dismissive, and set about stirring the coals. He poured water into a blackened kettle and hung it over the flame. All the while, he watched her not with suspicion, but with the measured caution of a man cataloging a new threat. Her fingers stroked the baby's damp hair, though they shook so badly she could hardly manage it. The kettle hissed. Jonah poured hot water into 2 tin cups and slid one toward her. She gripped it with both hands, the warmth a shocking, painful blessing against her frozen skin. He leaned back on his heels, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Why here? Martha lowered the cup, her gaze fixed on the rising steam. We had nowhere else. Walked till my legs near gave out. Folks in the valley. They said there was a man up the ridge. Alone. Her eyes, bruised with exhaustion, lifted to meet his. They said you wouldn't turn a woman and a babe into the snow. Her words faltered, but her gaze held a steely resolve that defied her broken state. Tell me they were right. Jonah's silence stretched as cold and vast as the storm outside. He had invited no one. He had asked for nothing but to be left alone with his ghosts. He knew he could send her away. It would mean her death and the child's. A part of him, the hard, bitter part that had kept him alive, whispered that it was not his concern. Their fate was not his burden. But he saw the way she pulled the quilt higher around her son, saw the fierce, animalistic love in her eyes. It was a look he remembered seeing in his own wife's face. The memory was a knife twisting in an old wound. Who's they? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. Martha flinched. Just people. In the mining camp, prospectors. They were wrong, he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He watched for her hope to break, for her to crumple. Instead, her chin lifted a fraction higher. I'll sleep outside your door if I must, she whispered again, her voice frayed but fierce. But he won't last the night out there. Please. Jonah closed his eyes briefly. He saw a dusty street. He saw a small, still form. He heard a gunshot echoing in a world gone silent. When he opened them again, he was moving without conscious thought. He took a thick wool blanket from his cot and laid it over her, tucking it around the baby's tiny form. You'll stay, he said simply. The words were a surrender. They carried no softness, but no threat either, just a weight that brooked no argument. For the first time, the rigid lines of fear on Martha's face slackened. She exhaled a long, shaky breath of disbelief and relief. Her head dropped back against the rug, and though she tried to fight it, sleep dragged her under like a powerful current. Jonah retreated to the lone chair by the hearth, his eyes fixed on the mother and child. Outside, the storm raged, battering the shutters like a beast denied its prey. Inside, for the first time in 5 years, his cabin was not empty. He looked from the sleeping woman and child to the carved bluebird on the mantel. The world he had tried so hard to outrun had just knocked on his door, and he, against all reason, had let it in. The silence that settled after the storm was heavy and fragile. For 2 days, Jonah, Martha, and Samuel existed in a state of wary truce. 3 strangers bound by the walls of the cabin and the deep snow that had cut them off from the world. Jonah moved with his usual grim efficiency, but his solitude had been breached. The small sounds of their presence, Samuel's soft coos, Martha's quiet humming, were constant reminders of the life that had invaded his self-imposed exile. He found himself watching them, a strange ache in his chest, whenever Samuel's pale blue eyes, full of blind, innocent trust, met his. On the 3rd night, the hoofbeats came. They were faint at first, muffled by the snow, but Jonah's ears, honed by years of listening to the mountain secrets, caught the unnatural rhythm. He rose from his chair without a sound, his hand reaching for the rifle, leaning against the wall. "What is it?" Martha whispered, her body instantly tense. She had been rocking Samuel by the fire, her face softened by the warm glow. Now fear sharpened it again. Jonah pressed a finger to his lips, motioning her toward the shadows in the corner of the room. He moved to the window, easing the shutter open a hair's breadth. 3 riders sat on their horses at the edge of the clearing, and their forms dark silhouettes against the moonlit snow. They weren't lost travelers. They were watching the cabin, their stillness radiating a predatory patience. Jonah let the shutter fall back into place. "Stay down," he whispered. "Don't make a sound." The knock, when it came, was hard and demanding. Evening in there, a voice called smooth with a confidence that grated on Jonah's nerves. "Saw your smoke. Figured we'd stop for a bit of neighborly warmth." Jonah remained silent, his rifle held ready. The men outside waited, and then the leader's voice turned cold. "Don't be difficult. We know she's in there. A woman and a child traveling alone. We're just here to see them home safe." Martha's breath hitched. Her knuckles went white as she clutched Samuel, who began to fuss, his small cries muffled against her shoulder. Jonah's gaze flickered to her, his expression hardening. They knew. A boot slammed against the door, making the wood groan. "Last chance, friend, open up, or we open it for you." The standoff was broken not by a bullet, but by Samuel's cry, a thin, piercing wail that cut through the thick walls of the cabin. Outside, one of the men laughed a triumphant, ugly sound. "There's our little prize." The doors shuddered under a coordinated assault. Wood splintered. The iron latch bent. Jonah knew it wouldn't hold. He braced himself not in front of the door, but to the side, using the hearth stone chimney as cover. The door crashed inward. 3 men spilled into the room, pistols drawn, their eyes sweeping the shadows. The leader, a man with a cruel scar that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer, spotted Martha cowering in the corner. "Well now, there you are, Martha," he said, his voice slick with false sympathy. "Mr. Garrison was so worried." Jonah fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The leader staggered back, his arm exploding in a spray of red. He howled in pain, his pistol clattering to the floor. The other 2 men, momentarily stunned, reacted a fraction too late. Jonah used the rifle as a club, swinging the heavy stock into the jaw of the second man, who collapsed in a heap. The third raised his pistol, but Jonah was already on him, a whirlwind of brutal efficiency. He disarmed the man with a sharp twist of the wrist and drove an elbow into his throat, sending him choking and gasping to the floorboards. The fight was over in seconds. The leader, clutching his mangled arm, scrambled back out the door, his face a mask of shocked fury. "You'll regret this, mountain man," he spat, his voice thick with pain. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." His remaining conscious man dragged their unconscious partner out into the snow. They mounted their horses and galloped away, their threats swallowed by the night. Jonah slammed the broken door shut, bracing it with a heavy table. He stood breathing heavily, the smell of gunpowder sharp in his nostrils. He turned to Martha. She was trembling, but her eyes held a new light, not just fear, but a flicker of awe. "Garrison Jonah," said the name, a cold weight on his tongue. "Ambrose Garrison." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He's Samuel's father. He sent them to take him. He wants him dead." The name echoed in the chambers of Jonah's memory, pulling a 5-year-old ghost from its shallow grave. Ambrose Garrison, the charismatic outlaw, the man with the silver-plated revolver, the architect of his ruin. Suddenly, the fight was no longer about a stranger's plea. The men who had just broken down his door were servants of the same devil who had stolen his world. He looked from the broken door to the terrified woman and the whimpering child. He knew this was just the beginning. Garrison would not be deterred by 3 failed men. He would send an army if he had to. Staying on the ridge was a death sentence. "Pack what you can carry." Jonah said, his voice a low growl of newfound purpose. We're leaving. Leaving? Where can we go? Martha cried, her hope faltering. They'll find us. They're expecting us to hide. Jonah said, his eyes glinting with a cold fire she hadn't seen before. They're expecting me to be a simple recluse defending his shack. They're not expecting a U.S. Marshal to come hunting. He strode to a loose floorboard near the hearth and pulled it up. From the hollow beneath, he retrieved a dusty leather satchel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was his Colt Peacemaker and a tarnished silver star. He didn't pin the star to his chest. He just held it in his palm, its familiar weight a cold comfort. The law had failed him once. It had not saved his family. But its ways were etched into his soul. To defeat a man like Garrison, he needed more than rage. He needed information. He needed to know the shape of the beast before he tried to kill it. There's a mining outpost west of here. Black Creek, he said, his voice hard with resolve. Garrison's men will have passed through there. Someone will have seen something. Someone will have talked. He looked at Martha, his gaze unwavering. This isn't just about running anymore. This is about finishing what he started. They left before dawn, slipping out the back of the cabin and into the deep woods, leaving the broken door and the bloodstains in the snow as a silent message. As they descended the treacherous slopes, Jonah leading the horse with Martha and Samuel mounted, he felt the 5 years of numbness beginning to burn away, replaced by a cold, clarifying rage. The mountain had been his tomb. Now it would be his armory. He was no longer hiding from the world. He was marching back into it with a new family to protect and an old score to settle. The journey to the Black Creek mining outpost was a grueling 2-day trek through unforgiving terrain. Jonah moved with a relentless pace, his senses on high alert, while Martha huddled against the cold, shielding Samuel with her own body. Black Creek was less a town than a scar on the landscape, a chaotic collection of tents, crude shacks, and a single saloon, all clinging to the side of a mountain that was being slowly disemboweled for its silver. The air hung thick with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and desperation. Jonah left Martha and Samuel hidden in a sheltered pine grove on the outskirts, a place where he could see anyone approaching. Don't move from here. Don't speak to anyone. I'll be back before nightfall. He walked into the camp alone, his duster covering the pistol at his hip, his face set in the grim, unapproachable mask he had perfected over the last 5 years. He was just another drifter, another ghost haunting the edges of civilization. He headed straight for the saloon, the only place where information flowed as freely as the liquor. The place was crowded, a haze of smoke and the low rumble of men's voices filling the room. Jonah took a spot at the end of the bar, ordered a whiskey he had no intention of drinking, and listened. He didn't have to wait long. The talk was of one man, Ambrose Garrison. Bought out the Miller claim for pennies on the dollar, one grizzled prospector grumbled into his beer. Miller didn't want to sell. Funny how a visit from a few of Garrison's boys changed his mind. Heard he's running for territorial governor next year, another added. Got the whole region in his pocket. Calls it progress. I call it theft. Jonah learned that Garrison had spent the last 5 years building an empire. He wasn't just an outlaw anymore. He was a businessman, a tyrant who used violence and intimidation as tools of commerce. He was buying up landmines and political influence, crushing anyone who stood in his way. His attention was drawn to a notice nailed to a post near the door. It was a wanted poster, but not for a man. It was for a woman. Martha Hale, wanted for the theft of a child. The reward was substantial. The lie was audacious. It painted her as a deranged kidnapper, erasing her claim and legitimizing his hunt. Garrison was not just powerful. He was meticulous. Jonah was about to leave when a new voice, quiet and educated, cut through the din. Heard one of Garrison's men came through yesterday looking for me. Had a nasty gunshot wound to his arm. Jonah turned. The speaker was a small, wire-rimmed man with ink stains on his fingers and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering. The town doctor. Jonah approached him slowly. You the doctor? The man, whose name was Elias, eyed him cautiously. I am. And you look like you've seen your share of trouble. I'm looking for information about Ambrose Garrison, Jonah said, his voice low. Elias's face tightened. That's a dangerous subject in these parts. Garrison has ears everywhere. He glanced around the saloon. Walk with me. Outside, away from the prying eyes of the saloon, Elias's story tumbled out. The man with the wounded arm had been boastful drunk on pain and whiskey. He'd talked about a stubborn recluse on a mountain ridge and a final assault they were planning. But he'd said something else, something that made the doctor's blood run cold. He kept talking about Garrison settling an old score. Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. Something about a marshal in the town of Redemption 5 years back. He said Garrison's brother Caleb was killed by this marshal. He said the bank robbery wasn't about the money. It was about sending a message. It was revenge. The world tilted under Jonah's feet. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Redemption. Caleb Garrison. The bank robbery. It hadn't been random. It had been personal. Ambrose Garrison hadn't just been robbing a bank. He had come to Redemption specifically for him. He had come to destroy Jonah Ward's life as payback for his brother's death. The stray bullet that killed his wife and child was no accident of fate. It was the direct consequence of a blood feud he never even knew he was a part of. The grief that he had buried under 5 years of stone and silence erupted no longer a dull ache, but a white-hot, consuming fire. This wasn't just about protecting Martha and Samuel from a cruel man. This was about confronting the architect of his own hell. The man who had taken everything from him was now trying to take the one thing that had pulled him back from the abyss. This Marshal Jonah said, his voice dangerously calm, what happened to him. Elias shook his head sadly. No one knows. After his wife and daughter were killed, he just vanished. Some say he died of a broken heart. Others say he's just a ghost now. He's not a ghost, Jonah said, his eyes like chips of flint. He looked toward the mountains where Martha and Samuel were waiting. His purpose, which had been forged in the defense of innocence, was now honed to a razor's edge by the promise of vengeance. Protecting them was no longer just a choice. It was his only path to redemption. He had to face Garrison not just to save his new family, but to reclaim the soul of the man he once was. He thanked the doctor and started back toward the woods, his stride long and purposeful. The full weight of Garrison's evil was now clear. This was a man who would burn the world down to settle a score, a man who saw other people, his own son included, as mere pawns in his game of power and revenge. Jonah now understood. He could not run. He could not hide. He had to destroy Ambrose Garrison, or the ghosts of the past would haunt him forever. As he reached the edge of the camp, he heard a commotion from the direction he had left Martha. Shouts, the terrified neigh of a horse. He broke into a run, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into the pine grove to find it empty. The ground was churned with fresh hoof prints. A small knitted booty, Samuel's booty, lay half-trodden in the dirt. They had found them. Garrison's men had taken them. But as Jonah knelt, his hand closing around the tiny booty, he saw something else. A trail, not of the riders, but of a single person heading deeper into the mountains. Martha. She had gotten away. She had run, leading them away from the child. But where was Samuel? His eyes scanned the tracks again, and the horrifying truth became clear. One set of tracks led away with the horses. Martha's led in the opposite direction. They hadn't taken them both. They had taken the boy. And Martha was now alone, hunted in the wilderness. The air grew thick with smoke. Jonah looked up, his blood running cold. On the ridge above them, a malevolent orange glow began to bloom against the twilight sky, spreading like a disease through the pines. The trees that had been his sanctuary were now being turned into a weapon. Ambrose Garrison enraged by his men's failure, and Jonah's defiance was done playing games. He was setting the forest ablaze, a massive sweeping fire intended to burn Jonah out, to flush him from the mountain like an animal, and to destroy everything in its path. There was no time for grief or rage. Jonah's mind went cold and sharp, every instinct as a lawman and a survivor taking over. Garrison had Samuel. Martha was alone in a forest that was about to become an inferno. He followed Martha's tracks, his speed born of desperation. He found her less than a mile away, huddled behind a rock outcropping, her face streaked with tears and soot, her body shaking uncontrollably. They took him. She sobbed, her voice a raw wound. I tried to stop them. I tried to lead them away, but they just wanted him. Jonah pulled her to her feet, his grip firm. There's no time for tears, Martha. Look. He pointed to the ridge where the fire was now a roaring wall of flame, devouring the trees and casting a hellish glow over the landscape. Garrison is trying to trap us. We have to move. Now. Their escape was a desperate flight through a dying world. The air grew hot and suffocating, thick with smoke that burned their lungs and stung their eyes. Embers rained down around them like fiery snow, igniting the dry underbrush in their path. The roar of the fire was a constant deafening beast at their backs, punctuated by the sharp crack and groan of falling trees. The forest that had been Jonah's refuge, the symbol of his isolation, was being consumed. And as he led Martha through the inferno, dodging collapsing pines and leaping over burning logs, he felt the last of his old self burning away with it. The cabin, the solitude, the self-punishment, it was all turning to ash. They stumbled through a creek, the cold water a brief, shocking relief against their scorched skin. On the other side, a massive burning pine crashed down behind them, cutting off their path of retreat and sealing the fate of the life Jonah had left behind. He pushed Martha forward, his body shielding hers from the intense heat. In that moment, surrounded by destruction, his purpose became absolute. He had lost one family to fire and chaos. He would not lose another. He looked at Martha's terrified, determined face, illuminated by the flames. He thought of Samuel, a helpless infant in the hands of a monster. A silent vow formed in his heart, a promise made not to God or to the law, but to the ghosts of his past and the future he now fought for. He would get the boy back. He would protect this woman. He would be the father and the husband he had failed to be 5 years ago. This new family was all he had left, and he would walk through hell itself to keep them safe. They finally broke free of the burning woods, collapsing onto a rocky bluff overlooking the valley. They were bruised, burned, and choking on smoke, but they were alive. Below them, the forest fire raged, a funeral pyre for Jonah's past. His cabin, his isolation, his grief. It was all gone, consumed by the flames of Garrison's hatred. There was nothing left to go back to. There was only the way forward. He helped Martha to her feet. Her despair had been forged into a hard, brittle resolve. He has my son, she said, her voice raspy. He has our son. Jonah corrected her, his voice low and steady. He met her gaze, and in the fiery light of the burning mountain, she saw the truth of his vow. They were no longer two strangers thrown together by chance. They were a family forged in the crucible of fire and loss. "Where will he go?" she asked. Jonah's eyes scanned the valley below his mind, already piecing together Garrison's plan. There was only one place a man like Ambrose would go to stage his final victory. A place that held meaning for them both. A place of ultimate triumph for him and ultimate pain for Jonah. "He's going back to where it all began," Jonah said, his voice a grim whisper. "He's taking Samuel to redemption." The journey to redemption was a quiet torment. The world seemed unnaturally still after the roaring chaos of the fire. They traveled hard and fast, Jonah's grim determination pulling Martha along in its wake. They stole 2 horses from a remote ranch, the guilt a small price to pay for the speed they needed. Every mile that passed was another mile. Samuel spent in the hands of his father, a man who saw him not as a son, but as a piece on a chessboard. As they rode, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place for Jonah. He looked at Martha, at the fierce set of her jaw, the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon. Her strength was no accident. "You knew," he said, the words an accusation and a question. "When you came to my cabin. It wasn't by chance. You knew who I was." Martha did not look at him. She stared straight ahead, her voice flat with exhaustion and old grief. "My brother was Deputy Miller. He was on duty the day of the bank robbery. He died on that street trying to help you." Jonah's hands tightened on the reins. Deputy Miller, a good man, another life extinguished by Garrison's vendetta. "After you disappeared," Martha continued, "I started listening. I heard the whispers about a man living wild on the high ridge, a man who had lost everything in redemption. When Ambrose cast me out, when he sent his men after me and Samuel, I knew there was only one person in this world who hated him as much as I did. The only man who might have the strength to stop him. I didn't come to your door for shelter from a storm, Jonah. I came for justice." The revelation settled between them not as a betrayal, but as a final unbreakable bond. Their paths had been intertwined long before she had knocked on his door. Their grief sprang from the same poisoned well. They arrived at the outskirts of redemption as a dust storm was beginning to brew. The sky had turned a sickly yellow-brown, and the wind whipped dust and grit into their faces. The town looked haunted, a half-abandoned shadow of the vibrant community Jonah remembered. Many of the storefronts were boarded-up casualties of Garrison's slow, strangling control over the region. It was a place of ghosts. Jonah dismounted, pulling the rifle from its scabbard. "He'll be in the church," he said. It was the highest point in town, a place of sanctuary perverted into a stronghold. The perfect stage for a man like Ambrose. They moved through the empty streets like specters, the wind howling around them, tearing at their clothes. The dust was so thick it was like walking through a waking nightmare. Sand seeped through the broken, stained glass windows of the church as they approached, the colors muted and grim. The heavy oak doors creaked open into the nave. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of decay. At the far end of the aisle, standing before the altar, was Ambrose Garrison. He was holding Samuel the baby wrapped in a fine woolen blanket, a stark contrast to the rags he'd worn before. 2 of his most loyal men stood on either side, rifles held ready. "Marshal Ward Garrison," said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. He smiled, a confident, predatory expression. "I knew you'd come. I must say I'm disappointed. I went to all the trouble of burning down your little hovel, and still you persist. But it ends here, in the very town where you cost me my brother. This isn't about your brother anymore." Ambrose Jonah said, his voice steady, his rifle aimed at Garrison's chest. "This is about a child you condemned for being born. Garrison laughed, the sound bouncing off the stone walls. That thing, it's a weakness, a flaw in the bloodline. My legacy will not be carried by a sniveling, helpless creature. My legacy is power. He gestured around the decaying church. This town, this territory, all of it. Mine. He shifted Samuel in his arms, holding the child up slightly, using him as a shield. But you, Marshal, you are a loose end. And I do so hate loose ends. Your wife, your daughter, they were just the beginning of your lesson. Now you'll learn the end of it. The psychological war had begun. Ambrose taunted him, his words like barbs, dredging up the images Jonah had spent 5 years trying to bury. He spoke of Sarah's last breath, of Lily's small, still form in the dust. He was trying to break him, to turn his grief into a blind rage. But Jonah was no longer the broken man from the mountain. He was a father, a protector. His grief was not a weakness anymore. It was a whetstone that had sharpened his resolve. "Give me the boy, Garrison." Jonah set his voice a low command. "Kill him," Garrison ordered his men. The church erupted in gunfire. Jonah dove behind a row of pews, the wood splintering around him as bullets ripped through the air. Martha screamed and scrambled for cover, her own small pistol a gift from Jonah in her hand. Jonah returned fire. His shots precise, controlled. He was not the wild brawler from the cabin fight. He was the lawman, his movements honed by years of training. He took down one of Garrison's men with a shot to the shoulder. The other ducked behind the altar, firing blindly. While Jonah pinned him down, Martha saw her chance. She darted from her cover, her target not the gunman, but Ambrose himself. She fired the shot going wide, but it served its purpose. It startled Garrison, made him take a step back. In that moment of distraction, Samuel, frightened by the noise, began to wail. The sound of the child's cry cut through the chaos, focusing Jonah's mind. He rose from behind the pew, ignoring the gunman, and fired 2 shots in rapid succession. The first struck the rifle from the second gunman's hands. The second hit him in the leg, sending him crashing to the floor. Now it was just him and Ambrose. Garrison, his face contorted in a snarl of fury, threw Samuel into a baptismal font filled with stale, murky rainwater. He drew his own silver-plated revolver, the same one he had used 5 years ago. "Your turn, Marshal." Martha screamed and scrambled toward the font, pulling her son from the water. Jonah and Garrison fired at the same time. The church filled with a deafening roar. Jonah felt a searing pain in his side as a bullet grazed his ribs. Garrison cried out, dropping his pistol as Jonah's shot shattered the bones in his hand. Jonah advanced down the aisle, his rifle aimed his face, a mask of cold fury. He kicked the silver revolver away. He had him. The man who had destroyed his life was at his mercy, unarmed and bleeding on the floor of the decaying church. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily screamed in his mind for vengeance. Kill him. End it. Let him feel the pain you have felt for 5 long years. His finger tightened on the trigger. He looked at Garrison's face, twisted not with fear, but with defiant hatred. Then he looked past him at Martha, who was clutching a coughing, sputtering Samuel to her chest, her eyes wide, watching him. He saw his new family alive, breathing their future held in the balance of his next action. To kill Garrison would be to become him, a man ruled by vengeance, a man who lets death define him. To arrest him, to hand him over to the justice system he once served, would be to honor the man he used to be and the man he could become again. It would be an act not of revenge, but of redemption. Slowly, deliberately, Jonah lowered the rifle. "It's over, Ambrose," he said, his voice ragged but clear. "The law you mocked is coming for you." Garrison stared in disbelief, then laughed, a broken, gurgling sound. "The law, you are the law, Ward. And you're weak. Just like you were 5 years ago." With his good hand, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a concealed derringer. But Jonah had been expecting it. He was a step ahead. Before Garrison could raise the tiny pistol, Jonah lunged forward, bringing the butt of his rifle down in a sharp, decisive arc. The blow struck Garrison on the side of the head, and the tyrant who had terrorized a territory collapsed unconscious onto the dusty floor. The dust storm howled outside, but inside the church there was a profound silence, broken only by Samuel's soft cries as Martha rocked him, whispering words of comfort. Jonah stood over Garrison's body, his chest heaving, the pain in his side a dull throb. He had made his choice. Vengeance was a ghost's game. He had chosen life. With Ambrose Garrison captured and his hold on the territory broken, his empire crumbled like a house of sand. Word of his defeat spread faster than the receding dust storm. Men who had lived in fear found their courage, and men who had served him out of that same fear scattered to the winds. Jonah, using the authority of the star he now wore openly on his vest, turned Garrison over to the federal marshals who arrived from Denver, ensuring he would face a justice of cold iron bars and a hangman's noose, not the quick release of a bullet. The town of Redemption took a collective breath, the first clean one in years. People emerged from their homes blinking in the sunlight that broke through after the storm, and their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning hope. They began to clear the streets, to unboard the windows, their movements tentative at first, then gaining strength as if they were relearning how to build instead of just survive. Jonah, Martha, and Samuel found shelter with Elias the doctor from Black Creek, who had followed the smoke and rumors to Redemption, hoping to offer his help. In the quiet of the doctor's small infirmary, Elias cleaned and stitched the gash in Jonah's side. The physical pain was a dull, distant thing compared to the vast exhaustion that settled deep in his bones. He sat on a cot watching as Martha bathed Samuel in a basin of warm water, gently washing away the grime of their ordeal. The child, safe and warm, gurgled happily, splashing his tiny hands. Martha looked up, and her eyes met Jonah's. No words were needed. In the quiet of that room, the exhaustion of the battle gave way to the profound relief of survival. They had faced the devil and won. They were wounded, scarred, but whole. They were a family. Weeks passed. The harshness of winter finally broke its grip, and a tentative spring began to thaw the land. The mud of Redemption's streets gave way to new grass, pushing up between the wagon ruts. The sound of hammers echoed through the town as people rebuilt their voices, carrying a lightness that had been absent for years. On a clear, cool morning, Jonah, Martha, and Samuel walked to the small churchyard at the edge of town. The two graves were marked by simple wooden crosses, weathered by 5 years of sun and snow. Sarah Ward, beloved wife. Lily Ward, beloved daughter. For a long time, Jonah just stood there, the silence of the place weighing on him. This had been his holiest ground, the site of his greatest failure, the anchor of his guilt. He had run from it, built a fortress of solitude to keep its memory at bay. But now he faced it not as a ghost, but as a man. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small carved wooden bird. Its blue paint was chipped and faded, but it was still beautiful. He knelt his knees, pressing into the soft earth, and gently placed the bird on the mound of his daughter's grave. It was not an act of forgetting, but of acceptance. A final gift, a symbol of letting go, not of her memory, but of the guilt that had chained him to the past. He was no longer the man who had failed to save them. He was the man who had learned to save others. Martha moved to his side, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. Her touch was not one of pity, but of shared understanding of a future built from the ashes of a tragic past. Jonah reached up and covered her hand with his own. Samuel, whom Martha had set down on the grass, looked between them. He took a wobbly, uncertain step. Then another. He stumbled forward right into Jonah's outstretched arms, his small hands grabbing onto his father's shirt. He looked up at Jonah and gave him a wide, toothless grin. They were no longer running. They were home. Jonah looked out over the town of redemption, a place that had once been the site of his deepest tragedy. He saw not a graveyard of his past, but the foundation of his future. Martha and Samuel would stay. They would help rebuild, turning a name that had once seemed a bitter irony into a promise. Here in this town of second chances, they would build their life together, a testament, not to what they had lost, but to what they had found.